Typically, when architects are invited to speak in front of audiences, there's an expectation that we're going to talk about things that are new, some fantastic new 3D printing technology or the solution to climate change. I'm not going to do any of that. I'm going to talk about something old and boring, which is philosophy. My life kind of occurs at the intersection of architecture, technology, and philosophy. And architecture is what I do, technology is how I do it, but philosophy is why I do it. And I think oftentimes it's overlooked in favor of the newness and novelty of the technology or the work itself. The particular expertise I have in philosophy is aesthetic philosophy, which is the philosophy of how you relate to the world, of how you relate to appearances, and how you relate to the realities behind them. So in order to share with you this one particularly useful idea from aesthetic theory that I'm going to talk about, I need to start by telling you a story. So I'm going to take you back to 1980. If you're having a hard time picturing yourself in 1980, you just had less money and more hair. So it was right after the Star Wars movies, and I desperately wanted to go as C-3PO. And if you don't know who C-3PO is, you need to be smacked. He's a gold robot, in case you don't know. But we were a military family, and we didn't have a lot of extra money laying around, so my family couldn't buy the official mask, which was plastic, but my mom offered to make an outfit. So she went to the store, she bought a bunch of gold fabric, she bought me made some custom gold pants, a gold shirt, a kind of gold hood, a little round thing, and then she cut out the eyes from the hood and cut out a square mouth, just like C-3PO. And I put on the hood, and I was all ready to go out with my friends, and I realized I couldn't see a damn thing. She had cut the eye holes in a different location than my eyes. So I went out. Well, she's very quick thinking on her feet, and she just decided to cut out the whole face. Sent me on my way, and it worked. I'm walking down the street. People are like, hey, there goes C-3PO, until we get to this one house, and this woman comes to the door. We say trick or treat, and she looks at me, and she goes, oh, you are just adorable. Are you corn? So it hurt. It still hurts. But I'm going to use that tale to tell you a little bit about aesthetic philosophy. And the tale is this, that there's you, there's the world of appearances, and then there's your assumption of the reality behind those appearances. So the woman and I both saw the appearances, which is little boy in a gold outfit, but we had different assumptions of the reality behind those appearances. And I'm going to give you a kind of aesthetic philosopher's view of the human condition right here. When people have different assumptions of reality, and they're more or less close, when there's slippages, it almost always comes off as humor. So most sitcoms rely on things like, oh, I finished that beef stew, that was the dog's food. You know, some like stupid misalignment of little realities. And it's a joy. This is why we have things like TED. This is the human condition, that we have different perspectives. But it becomes problematic as your assumptions of reality get farther apart. When assumptions of reality get a little bit farther apart, you get things like bigotry. When these people hear of an assumption of reality, and they don't want to associate with people over here that have a different assumption of reality. When they get even farther apart, you get things like war, that these people's assumption of reality is in direct conflict with these people's assumption of reality. And war is when one group tries to impose their assumption of reality on the other. So this more or less defines the human condition. There's not a lot of things we do outside of humor and war. But what I'm interested in my work and in my writing is thinking about realities that are larger than that distance. What happens when you expose people to a reality that's over here? Another way of describing that is to say let's say there's two people arguing. One is saying, you deleted emails, you take naps, you kind of know the political... You kind of know how that looks lately. But imagine a person here and a person here, and they're having an argument. But all of a sudden, you put them in a proximity of an aspect of reality that's much larger than their little definitions of what's going on. In that larger context, their differences seem smaller. And that's a social idea, but it's a social idea that comes from aesthetics, which is unusual. So there's one really great quote that I'd like to read to you. We live in a universe whose age we can't compute, surrounded by stars whose distances we don't altogether know, filled with matter we can't identify, operating in conformance with physical laws whose properties we don't truly understand. It's a quote by Bill Bryson, and it's hard to have an argument about who didn't put down the toilet seat after you've read that. It should put you in a kind of like, wow moment, right? I think architecture historically has had this idea of form follows function. You've heard of it, where the building is supposed to look like what it does. My interest is that architecture should be form follows this. Form follows vastness. Architecture should be an ethical reminder of the things which are greater than us, and in doing so, make our differences seem less apparent. I'm not saying it's a solution to all problems, but I'm saying this is a step in one discipline, and combined with other steps in all of your disciplines, that's how differences get made. And I'm going to show you some very modest examples of this in my work. For instance, a store where we wanted to dematerialize the store, and in this sense, I want architecture to become a perspective shifting machine. So we wanted to change people's attitudes about what a store would be or what retail would be, and we did this faceted structure that we covered with mirrors, and this is actually a terrible photograph of it. The Vogue magazine photographer spent 3 hours in the store, said it was the most beautiful retail environment she'd ever seen, but she couldn't get a single photograph of it because the reflection was so great. So I'm pretty sure I'm going to go down in history as designing the first Instagram-proof room, if any of you want to lock your kids in it. We've done this with retail, with products. Instead of doing, this is for a fashion company hired us to design this store. Instead of designing racks of clothing, we put them in trees. If you look at the orange shirt in the back, we scanned a piece of that shirt, blew up the pattern, and made this little alcove to the right, where you could walk into this alcove and see the pattern at a larger scale. Then you could put on Oculus Rift headphones, and we had a 3D scan of the fabric, or you could actually walk across the fabric like a microorganism. So you're looking at fashion at 3 different scales, up in trees, at the level of pattern, at the level of bacteria. And that's trying to get something as mundane as a shirt to be once again mysterious. We try to do that with regular found objects. We are probably one of the holders of the largest digital library in the world of just regular objects. And we tried to recombine them in such a way that they become strange once again. So we've started doing these configurations of this language we call kit bashing, which is using not only a couple languages to design, but masses and masses of objects. So this was our competition entry that didn't win, so don't worry, it's not going to be built, but it's the Guggenheim Museum in Helsinki. And to do it, we used a vast amount of figures in really high resolution. And the idea is that there's millions of different ways to read this building. You might see different objects than your wife sees and come up with an entirely different narrative. This is a video that just shows that elevated platform, and it shows how you can recognize some of these objects, how some of them obscured. But the point is to create not an answer, not me telling you this building represents a bird, but a mystery that you're allowed to dive in deeper into. We also want to make these things. So part of my work is research, and this is a little bit of technology for you, but in my work at Yale, I also teach some of these techniques in kit bashing, and I sent 2 of my students to the middle of Italy to study with master robotic Italian stone carvers. And they programmed this robot on the left to carve out of a solid block of marble this kit bash language on the right, and you can see a little minion in there, because we literally grabbed random objects that we could find to create these kinds of structures. We don't want to encode the architecture with something that you're supposed to read. We want to give you the opportunity. We want to give you an invitation to curiosity. We did that again with this building, which the press named the Khaleesi after Game of Thrones. It's a little more obscure than C-3PO, so no slapping this time. But it was a building on Central Park South, which is intended to give something back to the city. Instead of a tall building being a tall, abstract construction like you see in the background, this was intended to provide people, again, with this kind of mystery in the sky that allows them to look at things in a different way, asks them to understand things in a different way, gets them to take apart their assumptions of what architecture is, or even what objects are. So this building is unusual in that every piece of the building is made from something we found online. You'll, of course, recognize the wings, but some of the things are much more difficult to recognize. And in that sense, it becomes a little bit of a puzzle. My guess right now is that you're looking at things, trying to imagine what it is you recognize and what it is you don't. We did some collaborations with Patrick Fallwetter, who's a concept design artist, to come up with the interior perspectives of these. So you see the image of the entrance on the left, the grand lobby in the middle, and the sky lobby, which has restaurants that let out to those large balconies, which is on the right. This trickles down to some of our smaller projects, like a hotel on the left, which uses the same language, but uses it to appear almost cloud-like, hovering above the city, or a residential building on the right, which uses this language of objects in relief, which is, of course, less expensive, but still allows you the ability to read different ideas into it. And the last project I'm going to show has to deal with fractals. One of the things we've been experimenting with in the office is trying to find the thing we can use that has the most information possible. And fractals are recursive and dense, and they take incredible amounts of computer power. So we actually had to design this fractal sponge in one computer, and then we had to use MRI medical technique to scan it, to then put it into our architectural software. So what you see here are getting scans taking of it. That are these different layers. And then we're taking aspects of these layers and using it to design, for instance, this building, which is our National Center for Innovation and Science in Lithuania. It was our design entry for that, and out of 144 entries, ours was the only American entry, which was either a finalist or an honorable mention. We received the latter. So it won't be built, but it should. So you can see the fractal language, these things, these pieces kind of moving around, supported by earth berms. You see the skin has this other level of detail. And when we get closer to the main entrance, you see that it's hidden, it's withdrawn, it's intended to withhold its mysteries and ask you to walk in through the door. You see the entrance here is very thin, and when you look above the entrance, you see a little bit of detail, and when you get closer to that detail, you see another level of detail, and it keeps drawing you in further and further, making you question your scale relative to this, making you question the assumptions of how you occupy the world. The last image is of the atrium that you experience when you walk inside, and it uses this fractal language in yet another way that stretches it and pulls it and implies senses of motion and aspects of science that aren't literal, but are in some way, again, inviting a type of curiosity that wants to make you learn more, wants to destabilize your assumptions of reality. Now, you guys have been very patient and very good, and I know you wanted to see lots of really great 3D printing and stuff, and I made you listen to philosophy. But I'm going to offer you all one thing to hopefully make up for it a little bit. If any of you would like to go as corn for Halloween, my mom is over there in the 6th row, and she brought her sewing supplies. So thank you.